Welcome to Disambiguation. I'm your host, Michael Fauscette. Each week, we interview experts in artificial intelligence, generative AI, and business automation to help business leaders understand how to use these tools for the biggest business impact. Our show today is From Pen and Paper to Agentic Systems, build an AI that works in the real world. I'm joined by Omid Pakseresht, CEO of Good Folio. Omid, welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, glad to be here.
So you have a really interesting background, and I know you've studied math at Oxford and quantitative finance, building risk management tools, worked, as the first product person at two B2B AI startups, knowledge graphs for finance, supply chain. So very diverse background. And then, of course, you founded Good Folio. So can you tell us a little bit about your background and then a little bit about how you got to Good Folio and a little bit about it?
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, you're right. I think I started in quant finance. I was actually talking about that today. I turned a whole lot of spreadsheets with VLOOKUPs into R scripts that you could run every day. So that was kind of my first taste of working with data and trying to scale things. But when I was doing product roles in AI startups, and this is, 2017, 2018, trying to do enterprise AI. And I remember there's this vivid memory I have of sitting in a hospital backroom doing some ethnographic research at the time. And there was a person there with a sticky note sticking their password to the screen. And we were kind of like looking at doing knowledge graphs for healthcare operations, and that kind of gap between technology and real behavior was just so ingrained upon me at that point. Walking away from world of finance to now product now really deals with real people. So that's, I think, something that became bigger and bigger as AI became more capable, let's say. And that's really fitting into reality and how we work today. So Good Folio was set up about 5 years ago. We were we're an AI platform focused on building applied AI systems that actually work in enterprise settings, that interact in the right way with the people and the environment, and they scale. So that's, that idea of things actually need to work and things actually need to interact with human beings that use them in the right way. That was installed in me early on in the AI days, and Good Folio is born out of that a little bit.
So I know that you operate as an applied AI venture platform. So the idea to build and scale different vertical AI, solutions from a shared technology foundation, and that's a different model from what we've seen from most of the AI companies that have come into this, building a single product or platform. So why did you choose that structure, and what does it let you do that a traditional AI startup just can't?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think we could talk about that one for hours. But I think most AI problems are system level problems. They're not really isolated problems. So traditionally, or let's say in the SaaS world, single product companies solve one slice. They get really good at that. They build new features and they try to kind of outcompete with their competition on that delivery. I don't think the AI systems world looks like that. So that merits new types of proposition. And to be honest, this is not something new either. Palantir is very, very successful AI company. That is not a traditional sort of SaaS business model either. So the way that we are operating, we're somewhere between a platform and a venture studio. So each deployment that we do, it improves the next one. There's cross-domain learnings that we use. There's real-world sort of feedback that shapes the platform as a whole, rather than just one. and just building that reusable infrastructure, the workflows, the systems that enables us to then provide a certain degree of depth in our engagements, be able to kind of land and expand, so to speak. And then building sort of some specialized systems ourselves. And typically we do that around, let's say, when there is a lack of data that the enterprise couldn't get, or there is a sort of a niche proposition, a vertical proposition we could create, that we deploy that product as well. So we've done that a few times as well. So we've got some products, some platform level capabilities that allows us to use shared learnings and a business model that's evolved to be fit for where we think the world is going, and fit for what we think we're good at as well.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, I think this year you're definitely seeing more and more narratives around vertically specific AI solutions versus kind of the horizontal approach that we saw over the last few years. I know you were telling me about an engagement you did with Unilever that I thought was really interesting, using computer vision to identify small retail stores across Indonesia, Philippines, Pakistan. And you mentioned that in those markets, you went from definitely pen and paper straight to agentic, WhatsApp workflows, sort of skipped, almost like the old narrative around necessity-driven innovation, right? Skip the digitization phase. So what does that look like on the ground? What did it teach you about deploying AI in environments that don't have that tech infrastructure that'd be maybe typical in a US implementation?
Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. There is an element of necessity that made that work, and it was really exciting to work on. But just to give some context, if you're in a sort of a small mom and pop store in Indonesia, and they have a freezer full of ice creams, typically about 50, 60, 70% of let's say flavors are not available. And part of the reason is that it's actually, it's lots of little stores, really, really complicated supply chain, literally millions of selling points. So, and part of them is that a lot of processes didn't really go through that natural sort of digitization stages that you would go through. So it's come really, really disjointed and siloed supply chains, really disjointed systems, and a lot of manual processes that tries to kind of fills the gap in how the distribution happens, how last mile happens, where the products are available, and so on. But that sort of 50, 60% of flavors not being available, that leads to loss of sales for the brand, loss of sales for the merchant, and an unhappy consumer. So you should theoretically be able to find ways that all the incentives align and you find a new system that actually works. So what we did, different ways of structuring this, different technology, AI technology that we try to use to actually solve this problem, pretty much the availability problem. But there wasn't really a lot to integrate with, right? There's people going with pen and paper, taking orders. There are brands hiring thousands and thousands of people to go and audit stuff. So what we did was we created WhatsApp or just messaging app workflows where these representatives or store owners, they can just submit images. There is vision AI capabilities and agentic systems that then off the back of that can do orders and replenishments and analysis, and that feeds to the head office, to distributors, and so on. And that can have a significant impact at the brand level. That can do 5 to 8% increase in sales of fast-moving consumer goods, which is not a small amount in this world.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting too, because it takes advantage of the tech that they would already have, right? The mobile devices and that sort of thing, and then ties that into this broader AI backend. So,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly that. There's lots of sort of adoptions and alignment and incentives and different aspects of that, but you make it as easy as possible. And as much value as possible for every stakeholder, and then you have a chance of actually scaling that. That was the biggest learning from that, I would say.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, you mentioned your other mature product, which is a financial services focused one, FinSpector.
That's right. Yeah.
Tackles the financial promotion compliance area, that friction between compliance and marketing and financial services. I know you're using an agent orchestration for, the quick monitoring, fast monitoring. Can you talk a bit about the workflow, how that operates, and what it replaced in financial services?
Yeah. Again, that's another instance of trying to kind of rethink the system slightly. Because what happened over the last few years with AI and AI-generated content is that now you can put out a lot more marketing, right? And now you can create more stuff a lot quicker. So as a system, in financial services in particular, everything that goes out of the door typically has potential risks and liabilities, right? It has a compliance process attached to it and so on. So as a system, you could generate a lot more content, but does that actually lead to more risk? Does that just lead to a backlog of stuff that your compliance team need to review? Does that create lower quality content, etc.? So that system wasn't really able to create that flow without sort of being a little bit agentic at the first place. So what we've changed is that we have a continuous monitoring system, agents that are optimized and let's say trained with the help of the compliance officers at the first place and the regulations that are in place for that industry, and that's embedded into every step of the marketing journey from production to post-production, monitoring social media, etc. So we didn't really automate compliance. We just redesigned the function such that it can have an overview of what happens and control of what happens and put safe rail guards in place. And as a result, again, this is one of those instances where marketing, once we get into kind of this get into engagements and get into scaling this, marketing is typically happier because they can be more agile, more reactive, and get stuff out quicker. Like traditionally, there would be, on average, 3 times back and forth between marketing and compliance before something goes out of them. And then compliance is also can sleep easier at nights because there's a little bit of less risk and there's less people knocking on their doors trying to get their content approved.
That's an interesting one too, because you're talking about highly regulated industries. I mean, we don't really think about that a lot when we just talk about the workflow itself, but the fact that you can scale marketing much faster in a highly regulated environment is not necessarily just a positive. Like there's a negative back into that too. So that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and these are the type of problem that we quite enjoy thinking about and working on. And it takes a lot of actually trying to understand what that system is, what the firms care about, what that domain requires, and so on. So yeah, we've been lucky enough to work on a few of those, and it's quite exciting.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I know when we, over the last few years, a lot of my conversations with businesses kind of started around the technology, right? Model quality, model performance. And I know you and I talked about this a little bit. You've seen that before too. But it seems like this year, the end of last year and into this year, we're starting to focus much more about workflow, which I think is a really positive development. I mean, why do you think that shift has happened? And then what goes wrong when companies lead with the technology, the model, instead of the process?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's I'm seeing that quite a lot these days, actually. I think what the models can do and what is actually happening in production, there's a big distance between that. And I don't think we're at a place where better models necessarily directly link to better outcomes anymore. I had a mentor who used to say, if we know what it is, we can build it, which is mostly true. It's not entirely true, but I think models are at a stage at the moment, with some exceptions, that they're good enough for most jobs. In fact, they have been good enough for most jobs for the last two, 3 years. So the constraint becomes the system design. It's like, how do you put guardrails around it? How do you have people interacting with it? How does it get better over time? How does it actually contribute value? And it's not just a fancy, shiny tool, which I think is the actual, the problem that does happen, right? If you focus on model quality, if you focus on accuracy, etc., you end up with really, really nice, impressive pilots and impressive demos. But the parts that, I mean, we just talked about ice cream in Indonesia in a little store, right? Like, of course, the model has to be good and it has to be accurate, but those models need to be speedy and need to work on WhatsApp. So the context is really, really important here. So I think there is a little bit of, we will see a shift of thinking about systems as a whole a little bit more than just the AI quality, the AI performance and the model performance, etc., because that is what it takes to actually scale it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's easy to focus on the technology, and I think that's probably, a problem with all the hype that we've seen over the last several years around AI. But I know we've talked a lot on this show about the problem, once you start to automate things without examining the underlying process, you can just make things break faster, which is probably not what you intend, right? So I know you've encountered this too. And again, we talked about this a little bit in the prep. So can you talk about, in an enterprise engagement, I mean, what does your discovery process look like so you can, figure out whether the workflow itself needs to be, redesigned, re-engineered before you build the AI on top of that?
I think that kind of depends a little bit what level we're talking to. I mean, I think if we're talking to board, there is a, let's say, where to invest and impact potential areas. And we have tools that we are building that help us do that. And we've had some interesting, really exciting conversations around simulating outcomes and so on. But the more typical thing is actually trying to map workflows. And that involves kind of identifying leverage points, identifying the actors, different stakeholders involved. It's a question of really understanding the bottlenecks, what's actually important to that business. It's a little bit of, I sometimes describe it as, if you're trying to build agents, you're almost trying to hire new people, create a new department, whatever it may be. Unless you understand the business, you can't just insert that thing in there and expect that it works. So I think that's that for us, and that can be a really quick process. Like we've done that over an hour, kind of understood that business and tried to suggest something. But businesses can be more complex, and things like financial promotions that we just talked about, that can be processes that has a lot of stakeholders. So designing something around that requires in-depth understanding. So I think that the building part, and I'm doing myself a slight disservice here, the building part is now the fast part, right? Like eventually you should be able to be at a stage, and that's where we're trying to get to a stage where once the requirement is ready, the production and the QA and the development and all of that stuff can happen in days, hours, minutes. It's understanding the requirements and making sure it's going to work, and the guardrails and the systems around it. The actual product development or the agent development, etc., that's a function of getting faster and faster at that.
I mean, it makes sense that you want to leverage the capabilities to, more effectively execute whatever that workflow might be, right? I mean, if you're gonna, and this is something we've talked about for 30, 40 years or maybe more around systems. When you implement those systems, you have to understand its impact, and you can't just it doesn't work either way, right? It can't be a rigid process that you can't change on either side. It has to be able to adapt to the new capability and the workflow and move those forward together. So that, to me, that resonates. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree that this is not a new thing. It's just being put. It's just become a lot more extreme in the world of AI.
Yeah, I mean, it can happen and needs to happen faster, and certainly both the upside and the risk are bigger.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So I know you've made some really deliberate architectural choices in some of the different engagements that you told me about. So, and that's based on where the workflow risk sits, right? Can you give me some examples of a use case where you chose maybe a different approach than the obvious one, and talk a bit about the reasoning behind that to help the audience understand?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think just to kind of, I guess, talk about some of the examples we already mentioned. In the context of the retail one, I briefly mentioned we have a whole ensemble of very small models that are lightweight, distributed. They can do very, very specific parts. And that enables us the flexibility to work with different stakeholders in, let's say, through WhatsApp, work in low connectivity areas, etc. And we had to do that. Whereas if that product, 5 years ago, it would have been a question of optimizing for accuracy of how well the models detect the images, right? How well they have, what percentage of SKUs or flavors it detected correctly. And that's a different thing to optimize for. I think we kind of went past very quickly realized that actually we can get good enough accuracy to solve a big part of the problem. Then we started worrying about actually, okay, this needs to be lightweight, infrastructure needs to work, needs to create agents on top of it, and so on. So the focus wasn't what we would have thought at the start is going to be the focus, because we got the quality quickly enough.
No, that's interesting, because and we've talked about this some on the show before. The idea, we go into this, we think, oh, large language model, I have to have that. But that's not really a decision that you can make up front. It's a decision you make is based on the workflow itself, right? There are places in there where a small model or a mid-sized model makes a lot more sense, especially if you need to vertically focus that process on something that is very contained in that business, in that industry.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think just we use similar vision models, retrained, similar graph technology also in the compliance proposition that I described. The similar components and capabilities, but they are architected extremely differently, and they optimize for very, very different things, right? The agent that's dealing with compliance, that needs to have a really good understanding of the compliance space, right? It needs to have a lot of regulatory knowledge embedded into it. The guardrails and need around that are very, very different, right? 80% is not good enough. There's a different, or false positives is not something that you want to deal with.
Yeah.
So you're spot on. It's there's a slight. There's almost for people like myself, there's too many good things that you could work with at the moment. So trying to kind of, let's say, pick the right tool for the right job is always going to be a challenge.
Yeah. I mean, that's even just running a small business. I'm constantly evaluating new tools to try to figure out the right place to apply this and the right tool, the right place, the right time in the process, that sort of thing. So that definitely resonates. It strikes me that you've some really interesting experiences working across a lot of different industries and domains and the solutions that you built. I mean, you got retail and emerging markets or financial compliance or healthcare ops, even neurological diagnostics with GoodMind. I mean, what common patterns do you see that seem to come out across all of these verticals? And then what's the unique piece about each of those?
Really good question. I think they almost sound trivial when you think about it in hindsight, but it always comes down quite a lot of sort of systems over models, right? It's as you can have the best model in the world, you can't do anything with it unless you have a system around it that actually makes use of that. And there are enough, as we know, there are enough, very, very good firms focusing on those models and improving those models. This is now a question of system. The adoption will come from that, and that repeats. That's not new to AI, as you said. That's actually always been the case, but it's really visible to me, regardless of the industry that we work with. I think there is something there's a couple of things that I've picked up on that are not necessarily spoken about quite as much. And one of them is, and both of them around sort of the bottlenecks of adoption, why things don't scale. One of them is that I don't think enough thought is put into necessarily sort of like incentives in terms of, okay, how are different people that need to interact with this system actually going to benefit from this? Why would they actually use it? I think there is a little bit of, and that again goes kind of across industries, there's a little bit of top-down thinking about that. Sometimes that doesn't lead to the best outcomes, doesn't lead to people wanting to use the system. Yeah. And in a similar vein, I would say there is a little bit too much focus, both strategically and even sort of linguistically, in how we talk about stuff, on efficiency gains and what you can do with AI to optimize stuff, and not enough on sort of covering new surfaces and growth areas and so on, which is what I would rather spend my time thinking about anyway. And I find that kind of is easier to get people aligned around that than it is if you're constantly talking about efficiency. Mm-hmm.
I mean, talking about people too, this is something I've had a few guests on to look at the human side of the implementation versus the technology. And it does seem like and I guess we've always sort of had some issues around change management and actually doing change management, but it does seem like that's been a bigger problem with AI than some of it is. The changes happen fast. There's a lot of hype around job loss and reskilling and all these different things. So a lot of scariness out there, I guess. So from your experience in these different industries and markets, what have you learned about adoption and how you can drive change management that you wish more companies understood before they jumped into this?
I think the problems kind of start really, really early on in the sort of the design phase and in how you think about AI. I think there is a natural, understandable sort of fear and resistance from some stakeholders, and I think that's something that you typically can't just hope that it goes away, right? I think one thing that I always say is that if you're kind of looking at compliance solutions and you using AI in compliance and you don't have the compliance people in the room leading that initiative, that's not likely going to work, right? And I think that plays out quite a lot. I think adoptions is a bit of a design problem, right? And if you haven't thought about that system and the incentives of the people that are part of that system at the start, then it ends up going sideways one way or another. I think that's something that I always kind of go back to at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, you can roll out the best system in the world. If nobody uses it, it doesn't have any value, right?
Yeah, and if it can have the best intentions, and if they think that it's actually there to replace their job, that's also, they're also not going to use it.
And I mean, that's fair. That's fair. If I think I'm going to be replaced, I'm probably not going to embrace that so easily, right? I mean,
exactly.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Well, we have a lot of business leaders that listen to the show, and so I'm just, for them, who, right now, who has a workflow they know is, inefficient, right? I mean, that's a common thing. We know this workflow has some issues, but you're not really sure what AI to use or how to apply it. I mean, how should they think about that? What questions should business leaders ask before they bring in a solution like GoodFolio, for example?
Yeah, very good question. I think, if I could offer one thing, is that a lot of conversations start with what can AI do, which I think is actually is the wrong way around. It leads to chasing the wrong use cases. I think it's actually a business. It's a relatively traditional way of thinking that helps the most. Is where does the system break? What action can offer leverage in business? What can lead to a behavior change that unlocks growth. If it doesn't really change stuff fundamentally, then it probably doesn't really matter. So if you're thinking about AI, you really need to think about, okay, what are the biggest leverage points? What are the biggest growth levers in my business? And then, is there a tool that can help me do that? And the answer probably is, there probably is a tool that can help you do that. But if you go from the tool to the problem, you're not going to likely find the right use cases, and you'll end up chasing things that are interesting, not things that matter.
I mean, that makes sense that you're really focusing back on what's the process and where's the highest value back to the business, so I can attack those kinds of issues first, establish the ROI, go through the change management, get the right use, and move that into production so that you do have good use cases to point to across the business to drive more adoption and value, right? I mean, if I'm investing, I want to get something back for that investment.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think and often I also find that once you've gone on that journey and you've understood and you actually blueprinted what might happen and implemented it and got the ROI, then the next use cases are increasingly more and more clear, and you have the framework to be able to do that. But if you start just piloting without thinking through how that would scale, then it kind of leads to a bit of fatigue as well. I mean, I've spoken to organizations that are like, oh no, another AI pilot. Yeah, I understand why you say that. There's a good reason for that.
No, I get it. I mean, it's like we're going to do another proof of concept, and it, it's fine in a contained environment, but once you move things into production, you have to scale them. If you haven't thought of all those other issues around the process and the workflow, it's a fast way to break things, I guess, or at least scare the people. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. All intuitive, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, at the end of the episode, every time I like to ask a question and just get a recommendation for the audience. So could you suggest somebody, an author or a thought leader, somebody that you think the audience would benefit from checking out, following, reading, that sort of thing, just to help them, educate themselves?
Yeah, I think probably would expect a AI book, but I'm actually going to say Matt Lerner's Growth Lever is super helpful, and it's become even more relevant in the world of AI, because it really makes you start thinking about leverage points and what you can change in the business and in your frameworks that lead to growth. And I think that's absolutely what's typically missed in thinking about where AI sits in systems and workflows. So that way of thinking will help a lot with AI as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great example of this, and I've gotten some really interesting recommendations through through all the episodes, and it's not always focused on AI. A lot of it is thinking correctly about your business, about your life, about the way you're approaching things. I mean, I had somebody recently suggest rereading on Thoreau's works, and I think. There's a lot to be said for a lot of these different broad-based things to take a look at and self-improvement, but also the way you're going forward in your business. So that makes sense. So Omid, I really appreciate you joining today. Really interesting conversation. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
And that's the show for this week. Thank you all for joining us. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to the show. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a review to help others find us. For more research on AI and other software, check out arianresearch.com. If you're an expert in AI, generative AI, or business automation, either as a provider or an end user, email your information to disambiguation@arianresearch.com. Don't forget to join us next week. Disambiguation is an Arian Research production. I'm Michael Fauscette, and this is the Disambiguation Podcast.